First, I just want to thank Wes and Will and for their leadership in establishing the speaker series, and thank all of you for coming out. And to preface this all by saying this is work in progress. This is the first time we're doing a longer version of this presentation. Victor Wang up here is the PhD student who is co-author on this work. I'm going to be talking about a little bit some other work that he also played a role in with my colleague Nick Marta. But mostly this represents work that Victor and I have been doing together, and it is very much in progress. So a key concern of science and technology studies is the question of how technological objects are enmeshed in social order. And STS scholar Sheila Jasanoff suggests collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures animate our shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. Through our research, we're seeking to show how those sociotechnical imaginaries play a role in the co-production of artificial intelligence, and most importantly, its governance mechanisms. The title of our talk, I'm appreciative of Victor doing the slides, but you got to back up for a second. The title of our talk refers to one such imaginary, dominated by the specter of catastrophic and existential risk, borrowing the title of the book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, by AI safety researchers Eliza, I'm always mispronouncing his name, Yudovkovsky and Nate Soares. You can go forward now, Victor. Thank you. So here's what I'm hoping I can do today. Maybe we have a little less time than anticipated, so maybe a little bit of a rush to the end. One, kind of what are sociotechnical imaginaries and why they matter. Two, to introduce three contested AI sociotechnical imaginaries and their anticipated forms of governance. And then three, show how these imaginaries in real time are shaping some of the emerging forms of governance. All right, so sociotechnical imaginaries. This isn't just about like your imagination that you used when you were a kid, right? Sociotechnical imaginaries are a useful idiom or analytic to disentangle different practices, propose regulatory futures, establish technological visions. They're not just about metaphors, they're not just about words, they're about practices and structures and institutions even. Jasanoff talks about them as group achievements that shape the achievement of social order. They're contingent, fluid, and plural. So as we determine how AI should be governed, we have to attend not only to the appropriateness of the responses and practices to matters of concern, but also how the construction of appropriateness and the framing of such matters are intertwined with the interests, norms, activities, and of particular actors and what they have to gain from stabilizing particular visions of our future. So I want to kind of start with these statements from AI scientists, engineers, civil society, and industry, and how they articulate particular visions for the future. I have a mess up in my slide. Hold on one second, sorry. Okay. These various statements, 2017, AI now, this pause, giant future of life, from the future of life, 2023, the co-founding statement from the co-chairs of the Partnership on AI, the Machines of Loving Grace, all of these are kind of speak to the role that these sociotechnical imaginaries play. Statements from the Partnership on AI, a multi-stakeholder group to conduct research, recommend best practices, and publish research under an open license in areas such as ethics, fairness, inclusivity, transparency, privacy, and interoperability between people and AI systems, and the trustworthiness, reliability, and robustness of the technology. This is a very particular idea of how AI is going to be used, and what kinds of governance we need to put in place to make that work. Likewise, the more recent Pause Giant AI Experiments letter centers the expertise and practices of scientific communities in shaping the appropriate response of law and institutional decisions around science and technology. Pause, let the scientists figure it out, and enjoy the long AI summer. The CEO of Anthropic in Machines of Loving Grace similarly paints an image of a desirable future, the role of AI in bringing that about and distributing responsibility on behalf of society. The AI Now Institute is also responding to an anticipated future in which AI plays a certain role and proposes a regulatory future in response that's grounded in civil liberties, privacy, and rights. In this way, these imaginaries of desirable futures come with social, political, and material configurations in the present. Going forward. Okay. So the contemporary AI governance landscape is shaped by three competing imaginaries that we refer to as responsible AI, frontier AI, and pragmatic AI. Responsible AI, or what we might think of as AI ethics, really emerged in the 2010s from scientific and technical communities in response to ruptures in their understanding of the professional ethics related to their work, forming a set of practices such as bias mitigation and transparency that continue to this day. That imaginary has spawned or forked into two different imaginaries that we see. With the emergence of ChatGPT, the salience of catastrophic and existential risk really propelled this vision of artificial general intelligence to the forefront of public imagination and also to technical imagination. In doing so, it narrowed the practices and understanding of risks, reproducing to some extent kind of a Cold War era of big science and configuring geopolitics. The frontier AI imaginary, it's stabilized by communities with at times very different perspectives. Should we have a pause or should we accelerate, right? These are very different takes on kind of what we should do in response to this AGI. Yet, in ways in which I'll describe in a moment, both of those communities are centering the technical, centering professional technical expertise in the solving of the problems. And so in some key ways, they both adhere to a particular imaginary of this powerful technology and drive particular kinds of orientations around how to govern and manage its risks and reap its benefits. And finally, pragmatic AI situates the governance of AI within that of ordinary law, ordinary technology, suggesting that AI doesn't require exceptional means of management. For those of you who come from kind of the science and technology studies background, you might think a little bit about the frontier AI and the pragmatic AI as being perhaps inherently political technology in that frontier space, as opposed to pragmatic AI being technology that we can construct and deploy in ways that match a wide range of values. So they are at some level like incredibly different in how they view the technology itself. And the pragmatic, all right, we're going straight forward. All right. So in thinking about these three competing sociotechnical imaginaries of AI, one, we wanted to show you kind of analytically how we approached disentangling them, and two, show you this disentanglement because you might take issue with it and have different ideas about whether or not we're doing a good job describing what we see here. In the responsible AI movement, for each of them, we're going to look at the vision. We're going to look at who's empowered in each of these sociotechnical imaginaries. There are different communities who are viewed as really important actors in doing the work of governance, in figuring out how to make systems safer, in figuring out how to address bias or whatever it is. Those communities have very different logics and practices. If we think about lawyers and legal logic, or we think about engineers and engineering logic, we craft problems in very different ways. We use very different methods to tackle them. And if we think about the effects, professional ethics and business practices are kind of what spool out of responsible AI. Frontier AI, we end up with some emphasis on industrial policy. We also end up with a tight coupling between AI and the nation state. And if we think about pragmatic AI, it's a lot of expansion of existing laws and perhaps upskilling and adding technical expertise into traditional institutions that do governance work. All right. So I want to dive into these three different visions a little bit. And I should pause at this moment and tell you a little bit about methods. The work that I'm talking about here is a very mixed methods project. Victor and I both did some independent set of interviews. My interviews were with, you could think about them as like the B2B providers of AI tooling. And Victor's interviews, which happened at a later time, are with the AI safety epistemic community, so a slightly more diverse and distributed group of folks. And as we talk about some of the emerging practices, we also have been looking at the reports they produce, lots of document analysis, and later on when we're looking at how these imaginaries are shaping governance, I'll talk a little bit more about the specific documents that we looked at in that analysis. So the responsible AI vision. So very much imbued with the values of the technologists creating it. I have to admit, I was a founding board member of the Partnership on AI. I'm a lawyer by training. I helped start the Center for Democracy and Technology many, many years ago, so kind of firmly have my feet in the intersection of law and technology and technical design as a means to kind of produce or help support particular kinds of values, privacy, security, freedom of expression, etc. I was really excited about the launch of the Partnership on AI because unlike earlier efforts, the Global Network Initiative, some other multi-stakeholder efforts that I've been involved with, the technologists were the folks at the table. And within companies, right, think about this is Eric Horvitz, sorry, from Microsoft, Mustafa, I think at that point, and maybe still, where was he? DeepMind, thank you. But everybody, it was the head of engineering or the lead AI researchers who were coming to the table, which meant a different kind of commitment in terms of financial resources, but also in terms of like how core they saw it to their mission. It wasn't just the lawyers or the regulatory team or the PR people, right? It was a real shift. But with it, it was also about manifesting this idea that the way in which we're going to develop a good future with AI was through engineering practices, right? It wasn't just through new laws or the enforcement of existing laws. We need to tool our way out of this, right? And so things like model cars and fair learn, right? These sorts of tooling that allow engineers and technical people to onboard some of the ethical work and make it implicitly part of their practice was really what the goal here was. Interesting, because of its birth in this kind of engineering ethos, it really is structured by the logics of the technical professional communities and its production, right? So in each of the firms that when I went and did interviews, one of the most interesting things to me was that the drivers of the responsible AI work, the folks who kicked it off, who were like, we need to do this, it was not a compliance person. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't somebody in the C-suite in that way. It was a technical person who really felt that this was really important work to get technically right. As one interviewee said, at a large AI infrastructure firm, we cannot outsource the moral responsibility of our technologies to third parties, right? So this imaginary is both the imaginary, the exceptional status of AI harms, as well as the location of moral responsibility within the scope of the designers, right? And that was a really interesting shift. I've been working to try to get designers to think about privacy or security or freedom of expression in their design processes. It's been a long road, right? And so to see them so fully and eagerly embracing some kind of ethical responsibility and doing some really interesting boundary work, right? That within each of the firms, there were privacy officers, there were accessibility officers, there were human rights teams. All of those folks were kind of marginalized as these new responsible AI or ethical AI teams were stood up. And those traditional subject matter experts who would be really important if we think about kind of rights and safety, they were viewed as resources for the technical teams to tap into, not necessarily leaders of this responsible AI work. Some of that was concern that lawyers have a key job in the world, which is to reduce risk and do compliance, and there wasn't yet a lot to comply with necessarily. And the second, though, is I think there really was this deep sense that this technology, all it does is classify and predict, and that engineers needed to be at work on the deep technical problems related to sorting and classifying society. So we then get, whoops, next one, I think, frontier AI. So this, I think, right now is the most ascendant sociotechnical imaginary of AI. It centers a very utopic vision of AGI as well as a very dystopic vision of AGI. It is a competing imaginary to responsible AI because it represents a shift in the massive responsibility from the ethical responsibilities of developers and engineers to the model artifact itself, right? Constitutional AI. Yes, you engineers are going to help, but at the end of the day, like the AI has to be ethical, right? And that really is an interesting shift if we think about where ethical responsibility is located. It is also a really interesting shift away from responsibility in that it takes on the logic and of business models and model development paradigms, which are increasingly resource intensive, characterized by scaling practices, prompting a set of kind of regulatory responses and governance approaches that take a very material turn, right? Data centers, et cetera. But also, because of that, emphasize the centrality of the companies who have that infrastructure ready at hand. And then finally, the emphasis on this utopian, like we could win it all, and dystopian. We have this existential and catastrophic risk that really ties into the nation state and brings with it kind of the securitization discourse, right? When we need to reduce who has access to our models. We have to impose export controls. We have to be very concerned about exporting our chips, et cetera, right? So this vision is very distinct in where it kind of positions ethical action, right? No longer in the engineers themselves, but in the models themselves. And it also has this like real connection to the frontier and to the nation state and competition, et cetera. Okay. Finally, in contrast to responsible AI and frontier AI, which are primarily driven by technical communities, pragmatic AI is a vision for AI that is not essentially technological. It centers people and communities. It centers their rights and safety. Regulatory responses to pragmatic AI are enacted by regulatory and enforcement agencies, the key actants, right? Outside the technical profession, these are lawyers. aided by technologists, but led by legal logics and legal practices. This competing imaginary is deflationary. AI is not the center of the world. AI is a really useful way to get all technology to be viewed as a place that we need, an object that needs to align with our values and our normative commitments. And it can be dealt with through the ordinary means of law, right? It's therefore constituted by standard logics of law, associated subject matter experts. And within firms, this imaginary is intertwined in legal and compliance structures. For instance, in privacy offices or human rights practices. This is not the view of AI that I would say is espoused by leading AI companies, but it is the view of AI that is emphasized by civil rights organizations, federal enforcement agencies, as well as a number of high-profile scholars in academia. And it really centers on the-ground socio-technical approaches to AI development, the expansion of existing laws to AI systems. It focuses on use cases and impacts, not models, right? So this is a very different, and you can see there's just some, the AI Bill of Rights, I think, is kind of like the high watermark in clarifying what that vision is. The AFL-CIO, as well as the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, both invested in creating technical teams to support their efforts, right? So bringing technologists, not standing up new organizations, bringing technologists in to support the existing civil rights and labor rights work. And this FTC statement, right? All of the enforcement agencies coming out saying, hey, AI is not a law-free zone. The existing laws all apply to this. And the way in which we're going to govern our future with AI is going to be bringing AI into alignment with our normative commitments as expressed in law. Okay. Yeah, you got it. Thanks. I'm sorry for the awkwardness here. So what do these imaginaries do? One, they're performed by professional and technical practices that are shaping our understanding of good governance. Two, they frame the problems, they bring us to particular agendas, right? Is AI about rights or is it about existential risk? They do have the tendency, if not to completely cast out, to push out some of the other ways that we might think about our future with AI and what's required to govern it. And they end up constraining what we view as the scope of relevant practices. They assemble different social actors to their cause while marginalizing others. And we can see this in lots of different ways, both in what I just described, but as we move forward too. Okay. So I'm going to move now to look at the ways in which those imaginaries are shaping the law. Or beginning to shape the law. Because these imaginaries co-produce our understanding of good governance through performances of these material and work practices, they anticipate a particular future and they aim to bring it about through reconfigurations in the present, right? So making decisions about whose work to invest in and what work to center as we try to build out this future. There are several scholars who I could cite here that talk about anticipatory modes enable the production of possible futures that are lived and felt as inevitable in the present, rendering hope and fear as important political vectors. But the key thing I want to underline is that these imaginaries are co-producing our understanding of good governance. I hope I've convinced you that there are different groups, corporations, social movements, professional communities that are stabilizing quite different socio-technical imaginaries through their discourse, through their practices, and through the structures they're building. I now want to share some insights about how those socio-technical imaginaries are shaping the law at three levels: agenda setting, negotiation, and implementation. But first, I need to explain a little bit what I mean by law. Law on the books. People often, and this, because this is an interdisciplinary audience, for some of you maybe like, why are you telling me this? But bear with me. People think, right, they think about the Constitution, they think about statutes, they think about the common law, the work that the courts do, the work that regulatory agencies do in producing rules. Yes, but what we're really interested in and where law actually is on the ground, right? I think you can go forward, Victor. So law on the ground, this is really about the social construction of law, right? That when we think about law, it is ambiguous, it requires interpretation, often by regulated entities. They interpret legal requirements through field logics, right? Through the logic of responsible AI or frontier AI or whatever it might be. And they try to take whatever is being off to them as the law and weave it into their business practices in ways that are as least disruptive as possible, generally, right? That is their goal. And the ambiguity in law provides them with opportunity to shape what compliance requires, but also creates a lot of uncertainty about what is good enough, right? And so when we think about law on the ground, it's a processual model of law. It's not the paper, it's not the words on the page. It's about the enactment, right? And that enactment is an interpretive act. Organizations are constructing the meaning of the law. They're also constructing what compliance looks like. And legal indigeneity is about how those practices and structures that organizations build out come back in to shape the law, shaping courts' understanding of what compliance with non-discrimination law might look like, shaping regulators' ideas about what good regulations might look at, shaping legislators' ideas about what problems they should tackle first. Okay, so law is ambiguous. It requires regulated entities to act under uncertainty. Their action, organizations are situated in what sociologists call organizational fields. And fields have logics. We can think about the healthcare field. We can think about the field of AI, I suppose. And those field logics and legal logics interact to help firms understand how to behave. Those logics are often competing, right? If we think about law, it is framed in liberal logic, right? Individual rights, protection against arbitrary exercise of power. These generally come through in commitments to due process and fair and equal treatment. Organizational fields, business and managerial logic tends to emphasize retaining a lot of discretion and authority for the institution itself. So as organizations are seeking to minimize the disruption of whatever being responsible in relation to AI is, it's being filtered through the logic of the organizational field. And in our case, engineering logic is also an important component of the field logic because much of the work in AI is crossing boundaries between corporate structures and academic structures and research institutions that are all working in this field of AI research. Next slide. Oops, no, one back, sorry. Thank you. As organizations grapple with what does it mean to act in a way that is compliant, they often end up adopting similar structures. The similarity in those structures, institutional isomorphism, can arise in different ways. So coercive isomorphism, adopting structures based on relations of power. This can be regulators leaning on you, but it could also be, and this is an example, I've done work in looking at how organizations enact security practices. It can also be insurance companies that are evaluating how risky your practices are, right? And they can be coercive because of the power they hold over ensuring you are not. Mimetic isomorphism is basically about trying not to have your head stick up above the crowd, right? We're not quite sure this is a good practice, but everybody else is doing it, so we better too. And so you get this level of shared arrangement. And then normative isomorphism is tied into professional norms and practices and how they shape structures across organizations in similar ways. Some of my earlier work looking at the field of privacy and how organizations understood and implemented privacy, one of the things that emerged was the importance of privacy as a profession and a real community of professionals who were sharing ideas about what good governance looked like. And they were things like privacy impact assessments, which were required in the US first. I know that's hard to believe, before they were required in Europe. Those traveled around and became institutionalized across the corporate sector, not because they were demanded from above, but because the professional community of privacy professionals decided that was best practice, right? That was how you went about doing. So this move to isomorphic structures can arise from any one of these three paths. An important thing to ask, given that these structures are infused not just with kind of the external idea about law and what policymakers are trying to achieve, but filtered through those organizational logics and then filtered through organizational business processes, is whether those isomorphic structures that emerge are merely symbolic. I like to think about the Facebook Oversight Board, right? It has all the trappings of a Supreme Court, but does it really function like one, right? So are they merely symbolic, or are they actually addressing the normative concerns that they are at least on paper seeking to respond to? Okay. So taken together, right, what we're interested in is how law and compliance are shaped over time through a process in which organizations respond to legal ambiguity, they create symbolic structures, they reconceptualize the law through the lens of management, and we're going to say through the lens of engineering in this particular instance. They help to institutionalize, managerialize notions of what constitutes compliance. And then law correspondingly becomes endogenous, meaning it's not just shaped by the legislature or the judges or the regulators. It is actually shaped by the regulated institutions as those structures come back in to shape legal understanding of what the law requires or what the law ought to require. Okay, so we're back to the law in action. How am I doing on time? When am I supposed to stop? 4:10?
Yeah, we started late.
All right. I'm not going to take my time, but I will. All right. So having explained what I mean by the law, I now want to share some reflections on how those sociotechnical imaginaries are shaping the law at three levels: agenda setting, negotiation, and implementation. Like AI governance, as I mentioned, this work is in progress. And so this examination of the relationship between these sociotechnical imaginaries of AI and the production of law as endogenous, I think it's really crucial to see the stakes at play in these imaginaries. While there's no distinctive federal AI law, there's a complex web of policies and practices emerging to regulate AI towards specific states. This includes a growing number of state laws, a set of quasi-standard setting activities coordinated and to some extent driven by public institutions. And the emergent nature of the AI governance stack, it makes the evidence that Victor and I are drawing from, and I'll talk about it as I go through each of these imaginaries, thinner than it would be if we, for example, were looking back 10 years from now, right? Often, sociologists of law are looking at hundreds of court decisions, right? We're not doing that because we're looking at this in the midst of the action. And so, for example, in a few slides, I'm going to provide an example of how corporate AI practices consistent with the frontier AI, STI, are bringing broad into litigation. But that litigation is in process, and I can't predict how the court is going to respond to the information about corporate practices. Yet, recognizing the limitations of studying this co-production as it's evolving, I think the benefits of studying the evolving governance structures is the insights that we offer, while they are tentative and thin, I think they offer us opportunities for reflection and potentially course correction at a time when many decisions about AI governance remain wide open. So, all right. I'm going to go through this one really quickly. Many of you probably remember in 2023, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, evangelizing on the dangers of existential risk, called for safety standards, responsible development, licensing regimes for AI development, basically asking to be regulated, right? Yet 2 years later, Altman, testifying in front of the Senate on a hearing about AI and competition, articulated instead the need to push back against regulatory barriers that could slow us down in the race, aligning himself with the vision of Senator Cruz's regulatory sandboxes. And this represented a real broader pivot by both policymakers and industry leaders towards frontier AI. Projects such as AI 2027, created by civil society actors with close ties to AI professional communities, centralizes AI as a technology of utmost geopolitical importance, vital to the survival of the nation state. Proposals to scale up energy and data infrastructure, the reshoring of chip manufacturing, all of these are solidifying into this socio-technical imaginary of frontier AI. During the Biden-Harris administration, we moved forward with a suite of AI governance initiatives that clarified that AI systems, regardless of who built or used them, should privilege the public's rights, particularly human rights and safety. The clearest kind of articulation of that pragmatic approach during the Biden era was in the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. But there are many points where the administration contributed to stabilizing the pragmatic AI STI, but I think also the frontier AI in some of the work. Importantly, these two comments, I think, are a lovely contrast, right? This is during the Biden administration's success for the US, not only preeminence of US technology and innovation, by leadership in developing effective global norms, engaging institutions rooted in international law, human rights, civil rights, and democratic values. In contrast, the current administration, a golden age for American manufacturing and technological dominance, right? Those are very different visions of what AI is about and what it's going to do for our nations. One of the important structural interventions during the Biden administration was the creation of the AI Safety Institute at NIST. And you can see it a little bit, maybe up here, but it had a pretty ambitious objective, right? It was to build the science base for responsible AI work, right? We don't actually have repeatable practices right now that we know are going to reduce particular kinds of risks. It was to identify best practices and try to socialize them. And importantly, it was trying to bring a broader set of folks to the table beyond just industry to articulate which risks should be addressed and which strategies were appropriate for addressing them. The US AI Safety Institute has now become the Center for AI Standards and Innovation, right? And I think the shift in name reflects a turn away from a broader effort to address the range of safety concerns and security concerns arising from AI. And it emphasizes collaborations with domestic industry to establish best practices. And I think most interestingly, it says that a key goal of Casey is to guard against burdensome and unnecessary regulation of American technologies by foreign governments, right? Very different ideas about how we're going to advance our future. Okay. All right. So I want to shift to looking at California. In California, we have very different communities stabilizing different imaginaries and supporting different legislation, right? The pragmatic AI community, we're just going to take SB7 as a particular example. A bill that would have provided notice of ADS use and employment. It was supported by rights organizations, unions, labor protections. And contrast that with SB 53, right, which requires certain AI firms to publish a frontier AI framework that discloses how they are testing and evaluating their models for a very limited set of risks. And that is supported by some civil society organizations, particularly some new advocacy groups that are more focused just on AI. It also ended up being supported by tech firms and communities and as part of the AI safety epistemic community. It's also worth considering whose expertise was tapped to provide the governor with guidance about how to regulate AI. SB 7 was vetoed. SB 53, many of you know, there was an earlier SB 47 that was vetoed. And Governor Newsom, in vetoing it, he established the Joint California Policy Working Group on AI Frontier Models and tapped the world's leading experts on Gen AI, including Fei-Fei Li, our own Jennifer Tour-Chase, as well as Tino Cuellar, who is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Social and Ethical Implications of Computing Research, to lead this effort. And the California Frontier AI Report commissioned by the governor takes a particularly narrow view, both on the kinds of risks which matter, as well as the means through which they ought to be addressed. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to dig in more, but just the most important thing to think about here is whose expertise is being centered in providing advice to policymakers about how to address the risks arising from AI. It was not the labor community. It was not the civil rights community. It was technical experts, right? Again, meaning that responsible AI or frontier AI in particular, sociotechnical imaginary. And you can see some of the shifts here. In SB 1047, unauthorized use of a covered model or covered model derivative to cause or material enable critical harm. In SB 53, it's unauthorized access to modification of or exfiltration of the model weights of a frontier model that result in death or bodily injury, right? So we have this shift from covered model to frontier model, the shift from uses to narrower categories around manipulation of model weights, as well as narrower categories of harm from critical harm to death or bodily injury. In addition, in SB 1047, under safety incident, the critical failure of technical or administrative controls, including controls limiting the ability to modify a covered model, is considered, but this is dropped in SB 53 and instead replaced with a frontier model that uses deceptive techniques, right? So really narrowing the emphasis. All right. I think we're going to skip this slide in the interest of time. All right. Now going to talk a little bit about negotiation. And so this is we're looking at regulation, in particular, OMB guidance, the Office of Management and Budget. It provides binding guidance to federal agencies about a whole range of things. One of the things that it did during the Biden-Harris administration was provide binding rules about how government was going to develop, test, and deploy AI. In addition to providing direction to federal agencies, it also provided direction to federal agencies about procurement. And why was this? Well, in addition to regulating, which the government can do, or legislating, which Congress can supposedly do, but certainly was not doing a lot of during the Biden-Harris administration, the government can use its pocketbook, right? Its purchasing power to drive developments in the marketplace. And so using government procurement as a method for driving corporate responsiveness to public needs, it's not new, very old technique. But during the Biden-Harris administration, we really wanted to use the pocketbook to drive practices that attended to the rights and safety of individuals and communities on the ground. This effort was cast by civil society. This was the organization stabilizing the pragmatic AI, Sociotechnical Imaginary, as their key demand. What they wanted the administration to do was to take the AI Bill of Rights and make it binding on the federal government. The Trump administration revamped the Biden-era guidance, maintaining much of it, which is interesting. But let me tell you, an interagency process is a big thing, and one doesn't want to rip up everything that gets done because they take many years. But it made changes that reflect the ascendance of the frontier AI and a retreat from the pragmatic, right-centered approach to AI reflected in many of the Biden-era actions. So I want to highlight some key changes between the Biden-Trump directives around federal agency use of AI and using the comments submitted by industry actors during the notice and comment process, explore how that advice reflects those different socio-technical imaginaries. Yes, great. Thank you. All right. So during the Biden administration, the emphasis was on rights and safety impacting use cases that needed to have a separate set of more rigorous practices. During the Trump administration, this gets put into a single category of high impact, right? A much more generic term, can be interpreted in lots of different ways, particularly if you think about the AI risk management framework, which is another Biden-era directive that comes out to help companies and agencies think about risks, but is much more of a process standard. It doesn't tell agencies or companies which risks to prioritize. And I think here you see this flattening into high impact, which is a little bit of like, you can decide which things are high impact rather than the impact on the people's rights and safety are the things that we're really concerned with. And it also removed many use cases. In 2410, we set out 28 example use cases of AI that are considered either rights or safety impacting. Safety, things that affect critical infrastructure, weapons systems, emergency services, rights impacting, covered biometrics, tenant screening. Yeah, you can get a sense. And so there's this like removal of these examples that are very centered on how AI is going to impact people on the ground and communities in replace of this high impact categorization. So this shift from safety and rights impacting to this singular category really closely tracks certain industry recommendations that are coming in through the RFC process. In the letter, Palantir recommends that OMB consider a single category of high risk, everything they do, no. Applications of AI that encompasses use cases of AI that might cause harm to individuals, at least they're centering harm. Palantir claims that the dual category introduces implementation complexity, right? Lawyers were very comfortable with terms like reasonable or rights impacting, right? And they're looking for something that is easier to engineer to, right? And it would detract from a shared level of scrutiny and common mitigations. Likewise, Google suggests a general risk-based approach that specifically targets high-risk systems. Want to emphasize the Biden era documents were not about systems, right? Typically, when we think about regulating technology, it does center systems, right? If we think about our cybersecurity approaches at the federal government, they are about systems security. The OMB memo broke with that. It was about use cases, right? The emphasis was not on the technical, it was on what are we trying to achieve with this thing and what's the impact on the people on the ground. And so it's interesting both that Google is pushing for high risk, but also pushing it to modify systems, not use cases. Very much technologists, right, want to be thinking about the systems. They don't want to be dealing with the messy organizational practices, the people, all the things that actually might influence how that use case affects people on the ground. Moreover, Google suggests that a predetermined list of use cases may preclude the adoption of AI systems that bring benefits to the public, particularly for historically marginalized groups, and agencies should conduct assessments that balance benefits and risks rather than make unnecessary general presumptions about AI technologies. I want to say the entire purpose of having guidance to federal agencies was so they could use it, right? Sometimes people are like, you're trying to stop people. I'm like, no, we just would have said pause, right? Like the whole point here. And so it is a little ironic. I think that there is no objective of having a general presumption. Sometimes the high risk use cases are also the most beneficial, right? Yes, if we're going to use biometric technology at the airport or at the border, it is very high risk, right? Getting errors are very consequential for individuals and for communities and their trust in government. But also, if done appropriately and with the right kind of use case, they can also speed things up a lot and do things that we might view as valuable, right? So Google suggests that a risk-based approach allows for a more permissible compliance regime. Yeah, we'll just go to the next one. Yes. So that reconfiguration of required minimum practices is accompanied by industry recommendations to adopt industry best practices. OpenAI, for example, recommends that the agencies follow the AI field's emerging best practice of evaluating the foundation model's capabilities directly. Nowhere in this guidance does it talk about foundation models, right? Google and Microsoft both recommend adoption of their secure AI framework and responsible AI standard, like directly trying to bring corporate practices, structures that they have developed into governance at a very specific level. As discussed in the description of the Sociotechnical Imaginaries, these standards tend to center the technical practices of design and engineering communities, as well as closely intertwine with particular socio-technical imaginaries that aim to bring about particular institutional configurations, ones in which agencies are encouraged to use AI. All right, should we go to the next slide? Mm-hmm. Great. I now want to shift and talk about technical standards. So technical standards and quasi-standards, like I just talked about the AI risk management framework, which is not a technical standard. It's produced by NIST, but it's really a process standard. It's about how you go about enacting responsibility. It's not about like the technical configurations you're trying to achieve. They play a really important interstitial role in regulation. Often federal law will delegate to a self-regulatory technical standard setting body the fleshing out, right? We want to have reasonable security. Well, let's see what that industry technical standard setting body comes up with, right? So there are ways in which we intentionally delegate responsibility to technical standard setting bodies to help inform what the law means on the ground. in this context, right, that isn't quite what we have. We have the creation of the AI Safety Institute, which is now, as I mentioned, been renamed the Center for AI Standards and something. But before that, the President Biden announced voluntary commitments from leading AI companies to manage risks. This was really important. It was Amazon, Anthropic, Google, Inflection, Meta, Microsoft, and OpenAI. But it was a commitment to engage in a set of practices designed to identify and mitigate risks to the public's rights and safety. Specifically, they committed to internal and external security testing of their AI systems before their release, to sharing information across the industry and with governments, civil society, and academia on managing risks, and prioritizing research on the societal risks that AI systems can pose, including on avoiding harmful bias and discrimination and protecting privacy, among other commitments. The first law that we have that is actually pushing for companies to both do evaluations of their models and to share information about how they do it just came into force in January here in California. But by creating AC, and there's also a UK AI Safety Institute, and we now have Casey here, it created an infrastructure where technical firms are coming in and sharing information about how they are approaching managing risks and informing how we think those risks should be managed. So this is kind of a direct vehicle. I'm going to quickly share two specific areas where you can really see this. One is in benchmarking. These are both benchmarking and red teaming. I'm going to talk about benchmarking really quickly. They are both benchmarking and red teaming becoming part of the kind of anticipatory compliance infrastructure through these technical standard setting activities domestically and internationally. Benchmarking itself has become a routine practice of the AI safety epistemic field, which ends up shaping what safety looks like. Consistent with prior socio-legal studies research, benchmarking and red teaming and other model testing and evaluation, validation frameworks, they emerge through a mix of academic research, competitions, standard setting bodies that allow model developers, all of whom are corporate and technical professionals who are often entangled through funding in ways that might shape the law, is in litigation. As I mentioned, this is very early days. OpenAI is being sued by 16-year-old Adam Rainey's family. You may remember he committed suicide in April. He was a frequent user of ChatGPT. The transcripts that his family got access to and that are included in some of the filings, the court filings, so you can see them, depict ChatGPT planning suicide with Adam and helping him cover up information that might have helped his parents actually intervene. And what's interesting is, so there's in law, there's a complaint that's filed. And then the company, in this instance, gets to file a response. And in this instance, this is OpenAI's answer to the amended complaint. And what's interesting here is that what they are pointing to, right, is their technical processes, right? That we apply safety principles at every stage of model training, right? This is about ChatGPT. They're talking about models here. System level guardrails, we're investing in long-term safety research. We do extensive pre-deployment evaluations. It goes through safety evaluation, red teaming, all before they're released. We collaborate with external experts, trusted partners, and researchers. Note most of those are technical, to stress test models and gather feedback. We have this preparedness framework, right? So they're basically talking about their internal practices and hoping that as the court is thinking about whether or not they behave reasonably, responsibly, hoping to persuade them that both the work that they do and also the warnings that they provide, telling you this is
not a real human, right? This is a predictive, that those things are going to shape the ways in which the court thinks their behavior is responsible or not. You can go to the last slide. But I think it's really interesting to think about, like, what does OpenAI really mean by safety here? The preparedness framework that they're talking about has 3 categories. None of them are really about reducing the risk that a user has a cognitive connection and relies on them, right? Like, and the activities that they engage in primarily consist of benchmarks, red teaming, automated adversarial testing, meaning automated all the way down. Like, there are no humans interacting with the system. And of course, it's accompanied by this frontier orientation of AGI. Next one. There is a change in field logic happening right now at OpenAI, I think, and they said they're expanding their safety work. They're bringing in the global physician network, right? They're bringing in different kinds of experts because they realize that making the technology safe, behaving responsibly, may not be something that engineers on their own can do. All right. So we offer these insights into the relationship between competing sociotechnical imaginaries and emerging regulatory structures in the spirit of imminent critique. Cash and Keys subdivide AI ethics research into internal critique that seeks to alter scholarship from within the scholarship itself, and imminent critique, which, while involved with the practices being analyzed, relies on context transcending claims. And they explain the need for imminent critique that highlights what AI ethics does. What is the work? Through our exploration of imaginaries and the regulatory frames that they can produce, we hope we've shown the power of corporations and communities of practice to directly and indirectly shape research and regulation, not by delimiting the content per se, but rather by establishing shared visions of our future, establishing shared practices, building alliances and structures that bound the contours of good research and practice, ascribe AI ethics work to certain experts in certain communities, delineate acceptable and unacceptable critique, and prefigure the fields and feed into policymakers' understanding of what good governance ought to look like and what it should seek to achieve. While Cath and Keys show that the work of many scholars working at the intersection of AI and ethics is shaped by the funding realities of contemporary academia, and that efforts to simplistically escape those realities are really entangled in questions of power, we hope we've shown how collective visions, shaped in part by the work and funding of companies, but also by civil society, by academics, and people in this room from various disciplines, and policymakers shape our aims and our actions in both obvious and subtle ways. As we use terms, as we center particular risks, as we fund and invest in particular methods, we should be mindful of the visions of the future they help usher in. So I myself am a bit of a pragmatist. You might have, yeah. And I do think the prescripting and normative functions of these imaginaries, particularly the frontier AI imaginary, while the others remain in the game, right? The pragmatic AI is contesting for space in her imaginations. That the frontier AI vision and its model centricity is pushing out other ways in which we ought to be thinking about the risks that we tend to and the methods we use to approach them. And so these are some closing thoughts from their work about what we might do and what we might invest in. So with that, sociotechnical imaginaries, they're how we collectively grasp the future. They're more than metaphors or mere imagination. They are material inscriptions by competing communities of their desired visions for the future. They shape our ideas and understandings of good governance and in which risks need governing. There are reasons tempers can flare and rhetoric can get heated because there's lots on the line as we choose which ones to stabilize. And I want to thank Victor and Nick Marta and Ken Bamberger, but mostly Victor. Thank you.